My family abandoned me when I was 12, so I built my own life, but years later I became the person paying for everything their children needed. When I was 12 years old, I learned that being someone's child does not always mean you will be treated like family. My mother had remarried a man who never really wanted me around, and for years I convinced myself that if I stayed quiet enough, helped around the house, and made myself as easy to deal with as possible, eventually he would accept me. I was wrong. My stepfather had two children of his own from a previous relationship, and when my mother eventually had two more children with him, the atmosphere in our house changed completely. I went from being her daughter to feeling like an inconvenience that had overstayed its welcome. The strangest part was that nobody ever sat me down and told me I was unwanted. They didn't need to. You can feel it in the way people look at you, the way conversations stop when you enter a room, and the way someone suddenly becomes irritated simply because you asked a question. At first I thought my stepdad just didn't like teenagers, even though I was barely a teenager myself. Whenever I came home from school, he'd ask why I was home so early. If I wanted food from the kitchen, he'd make comments about how groceries weren't free. If I watched television, he'd complain that I was wasting electricity. If I spent time with my younger siblings, he'd accuse me of trying to get attention. I started spending more time in my bedroom because it felt safer there, but even that became a problem. My mother would tell me I was isolating myself and being disrespectful, while my stepfather would complain that I was always hiding. There seemed to be no version of me that made them happy. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed one night, staring at the wall and wondering what I had done to make the person who was supposed to protect me seem so uncomfortable with my existence. The breaking point happened on an ordinary weekday. There wasn't some huge argument or dramatic incident that could explain what happened. It was almost worse because of how casually it happened. My stepfather told my mother that he didn't want me living in the house anymore. I remember hearing those words from the hallway and thinking I had misunderstood him. Surely he meant that I needed to spend a few days somewhere else. Surely my mother would defend me. Surely a mother couldn't hear her 12-year-old child was being pushed out of the house and simply accept it. But when I looked at her, she wouldn't meet my eyes. She eventually told me that maybe staying with another family member would be better for everyone. I asked her how long I'd be gone. She didn't give me a real answer. I asked when I could come back. She said she didn't know. I was 12 years old, standing in a hallway with tears running down my face, trying to understand why the woman who had given birth to me was allowing another adult to decide that I no longer belonged in my own home. I left with one bag. That's the part I remember most clearly. One bag, a few clothes, some school things, a charger, and a couple of personal items that mattered to me. My mother stood near the doorway while I waited for her to say something that would make me believe she still loved me. She didn't. There was no dramatic goodbye, no promise that she'd come get me, no angry speech about how unfair the situation was. She simply watched me leave. I remember turning around one last time because some part of me was convinced she would suddenly change her mind. She didn't. That was the moment something inside me changed permanently. I stopped expecting adults to rescue me. For the next few years, I moved between relatives and family friends whenever someone was able to take me in. Nobody was cruel to me, but I always felt like I was temporarily borrowing someone else's life. I learned how to become invisible. I learned not to ask for too much. I became extremely careful with money because I understood what it felt like to depend on somebody else for everything. School became my escape because it was one place where nobody knew the entire story. I worked hard, not because I was naturally ambitious, but because I desperately wanted control over at least one part of my life. I kept telling myself that one day I would have my own apartment, my own income, my own keys, and nobody would ever be able to tell me that I wasn't allowed to stay. By the time I became an adult, I had almost completely stopped thinking about my mother. I didn't hate her anymore. Hate requires energy, and I had spent years trying to build a life. I simply accepted that she had made her choice. I finished school, found work, saved money, and eventually rented a small apartment. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. The first night I slept there, I remember putting my keys on the kitchen counter and just staring at them. Those tiny pieces of metal represented something much bigger to me. Nobody could suddenly tell me to pack a bag. Nobody could decide I was unwanted. For the first time in years, I felt safe. Then my mother called. I hadn't heard her voice in a long time. When her name appeared on my phone, I almost ignored it. I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. Her voice sounded nervous. She asked how I was doing. I said I was fine. She asked about work. I told her things were going well. Then there was a long silence. Eventually, she started talking about my younger siblings. That's when I learned that the situation at home had become difficult. My stepfather had apparently become increasingly unstable financially, and my mother was struggling to provide for the children. She didn't directly ask me for money during that first call, but the message was obvious. She wanted to know whether I could help. I wish I could say I immediately hung up. I wish I could say I remembered everything that had happened and told her that she should have thought about that before allowing her husband to throw a 12-year-old child out of her house. But when she mentioned my younger siblings, something inside me softened. They hadn't done anything to me. They were children. They weren't responsible for what the adults had done. I remembered holding them when they were bobbies. I remembered helping them with homework. I remembered the way they used to follow me around the house because they thought I was the coolest person alive. So despite everything, I agreed to help them. At first, I only paid for a few necessities, School supplies, groceries, clothes, a couple of overdue bills. I told myself it was temporary. My siblings needed help and I had the ability to provide it. That was enough for me, but temporary became months and months became years. Eventually I was paying for more and more. Their school expenses came from my account. When they needed new shoes, I bought them. When one of them needed money for a school trip, I paid for it. When they needed laptops for their studies, I found a way to get them. I never made a big deal about it because I didn't want them to feel like they owed me anything. Then my mother and stepfather started depending on me. That was where things became complicated. I wasn't just supporting the children anymore. Somehow, without anyone officially asking, I became the person keeping the entire household functioning. If the electricity bill was overdue, I helped. If groceries were running low, I sent money. If one of my siblings needed medical expenses covered, I handled it. I was working full-time trying to build my own future while quietly sending money to the same household that had once decided I wasn't worth keeping. Sometimes I'd look at my bank account after sending money and realize that I had less left for myself than I had planned. But then I'd get a message from one of my siblings saying thank you and I'd convince myself it was worth it. My siblings were the reason I kept doing it. They loved me. At least I believed they did. They would call me when they needed advice. They tell me about school. We joke around. One of them once told me that I was the person they trusted most in the family. Hearing that meant more to me than they probably realized. I wasn't their parent, but I had started filling a role nobody had asked me to fill. I wanted them to have the stability I never had. I wanted them to know that when life became difficult, somebody would show up for them. I wanted to give them the childhood I wished I'd been given. Years passed like this. I became financially stable enough that helping them no longer destroyed my budget, although it still meant sacrificing things I wanted. I postponed vacations. I bought cheaper clothes. I drove an older car. I skipped expensive dinners with friends because I knew that money could cover something my siblings needed. I never complained about it publicly. In my mind, I was investing in their future. I believed that one day they'd finish school, become independent, and we'd all look back on those years as something difficult that we managed to survive together. Then my siblings grew up. The older one got a job in another city. The younger one eventually went to university. I was proud of them. I remember helping with moving expenses and buying things for their new apartments. I thought this was the moment everything would finally come together. They were becoming independent and I could finally start focusing more on my own life. I wasn't expecting gratitude or repayment. I didn't want either. I just wanted them to remember that I had been there when they needed someone. Then one day they both stopped answering my messages. At first I assumed they were busy. I sent another message a few days later. Nothing. I called, no answer. Eventually I noticed that I couldn't see one of their social media profiles anymore. I thought they'd deleted their account. Then I checked the other one, blocked. I sat there staring at my phone, completely confused. I couldn't understand what had happened. These were the two people I'd spent years protecting, the two people I'd financially supported when they needed help, the two people I'd sacrificed for without ever asking for anything in return. I called my mother. She answered, but her voice was strangely cold. I asked if everything was okay. She told me my siblings were busy starting their own lives and didn't want to be dragged into old family drama. I asked what drama she was talking about. She said they were adults now and had made their own decisions. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I asked her why they'd blocked me. She said I should respect their boundaries. Then she hung up. I sat alone in my apartment that night and finally allowed myself to feel angry. Not because they owed me money. Not because I expected them to worship me. Not even because they blocked me. I was angry because I realized that I had spent years trying to prove something to people who had never asked me to prove it. I had been trying to create the family I wanted so badly that I ignored the fact that the original family had already shown me where I stood. I went through old messages that night. There were hundreds of them, messages from my siblings asking for help, messages thanking me for buying things, messages telling me they loved me, messages asking when I was visiting. I kept scrolling until I reached the earliest conversations back when they were still children. I found a message from one of them that simply said, "You're the best big brother sister ever." I stared at that sentence for a long time. I cried, not because I regretted helping them. I cried because I realized I had mistaken being needed for being loved. That distinction took me a long time to understand. I still don't know exactly why they blocked me. Maybe they heard a version of the family history that made me look like the villain. Maybe my mother or stepfather told them things I don't know about. Maybe they genuinely wanted to move on from the past and believed I represented it. Maybe they were embarrassed about how much financial support they'd received. Maybe they simply changed as they grew older. I could spend the rest of my life trying to figure it out, but eventually I realized I didn't need the answer to move forward. What happened when I was 12 wasn't my fault. What happened afterward wasn't my responsibility. And helping my siblings wasn't something I should regret. I had given them what I could because I loved them. Their decision to leave didn't erase the good I had done. It only taught me that generosity needs boundaries. You can love people without sacrificing your entire identity for them. You can help someone without becoming responsible for their entire life. And most importantly, you can be a good person without constantly trying to earn a place in someone's heart. The strangest part is that I don't hate my mother either. I used to think forgiveness meant pretending something never happened. Now I understand that forgiveness can simply mean refusing to let someone else's choices control the rest of your life. My mother made a decision when I was 12. She chose her husband over her child. I spent years trying to understand why. Eventually I stopped asking. Today I have my own life. I have people around me who know my story and don't treat me like an inconvenience. I have friends who show up because they want to, not because they need something. I have learned to say no without feeling guilty. I have learned that my worth isn't determined by how much money I can give someone. And I have learned that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes family is the person who stays when there is nothing to gain from staying. I still think about my siblings sometimes. I wonder whether they ever think about me. I wonder if they remember the school fees I paid, the birthdays I showed up for, the late night calls, the groceries, the rides, the countless times I told them they could call me if they needed anything. Maybe they remember, maybe they don't. Maybe one day they'll ask questions and discover the truth for themselves. If that day comes, I'll decide then whether I want to open that door again. But I'm not waiting for it. For the first time in my life, I'm choosing myself without feeling selfish. I was 12 when I was taught that people could abandon you without warning. I spent years terrified that if I wasn't useful enough, generous enough, patient enough, or successful enough, people would leave again. So I became the person who gave everything. I gave money, I gave time, I gave opportunities, I gave forgiveness, I gave second chances, I gave until there was almost nothing left to give. And now I'm learning something completely different. I don't have to earn love. I don't have to buy a place in someone's life. I don't have to destroy myself just to prove that I care. Sometimes loving people means helping them. Sometimes loving people means letting them go. And sometimes the hardest form of love is finally turning around and giving yourself the same kindness you've spent years giving everyone else. My mother kicked me out when I was 12 because another man decided I didn't belong. Years later, I became the person who made sure her children had everything they needed. And when they no longer needed me, they walked away. It hurt, it probably always will. But I don't regret saving them from experiencing the kind of childhood I had. Because even though they eventually blocked me for a few years, they knew what it felt like to have someone show up for them. And maybe that's enough. Maybe I was never meant to be part of their future. Maybe I was simply meant to make their beginning a little easier than mine. And for the first time, I'm okay with that. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and comment for more crazy confessions I get from people.